Good morning. Today's speaker is John Beardsley. John has been a licensed insurance agent for over 15 years. He's going to chat with us today regarding flood insurance. John and his wife Susan have lived in Brighton Village since 2014. Thanks, John, for joining us today.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending. I know that water runoff and the resultant flooding is a big issue here in Hershey Mills. I live on the 16th fairway, and it doesn't take very much rain coming down to make the little trickle that comes down behind the sand trap turn into the Mississippi River behind our house. Gets kind of worrisome, and my neighbors get water from that all the time, regularly in their sunroom. Today, we're going to talk about flood insurance. My purpose here is to give you some background information about flood insurance that will allow you to make a more informed decision if you encounter a flooding situation. Questions are being answered today, or what I intend to answer is what qualifies as a flood? Isn't flood damage covered by my home insurance policy? Should I be worried about being flooded? Am I in a high-risk flood area, in a flood risk area? Some of the details about flood insurance help you decide if you need flood insurance, or things to think about when you're thinking about flood insurance. Talk about risk tolerance, and I'll give you some tips that I think would be useful if you get to the point of talking to somebody about purchasing flood insurance, and then we'll have some follow-up questions afterwards. So what is a flood? You'll hear somebody say my basement got flooded out, or my carpeting is wet. What does that really mean? What we know is that the person has some water in their house that caused them a problem, but doesn't qualify as a flood. Here's something for you. Well, the audience participation part, but actually just make a mental note of these questions. Which of these situations, common water situations, would qualify as a flood? Somebody has a lot of water that came in from somewhere and caused a problem. Their carpet needed to be dried out. Some of their furniture got wet. Their walls, their sheetrock walls, absorbed the water, and now it's now it's moldy. Water got into the furnace area and destroyed the furnace, water heater, washer, things that are down in the basement. Or maybe they just got a wet basement, like this one picture where they got puddles in their basement. So would any of them qualify as a flood? The answer is, it depends. Depends where the water came from. Did the water come from a broken pipe? Did the bottom of the water heater rust out? Washer hose explode? Is it a downspout issue? Water came in from outside, something's wrong with their downspout, and the water came in their basement. Or are they next to the creek and we got 8 inches of rain in 4 hours and overflowed, and just water came rushing into the house? All right. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. So like I said, the answer whether or not it qualifies as a flood is, where did the water come from? Because not everything qualifies as a flood in insurance terms. General definition of a flood is an event where water rises higher than normal and causes damage to land, property, or infrastructure. So basically, anywhere it rains, it can flood. Because water seeks its own level, lower lying areas are more prone to flood, or prone to repetitive flooding. Insurance carriers, being risk adverse, typically refuse to accept higher risk, so they charge a large premium to accept the risk. FEMA, the National Flood, or the National Flood Insurance Program, established by FEMA, defines a flood as a general or temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres of normally dry land, or 2 or more properties, one of which is yours. So as you can see, the FEMA definition is a little bit different than is more specific than the dictionary definition of a flood. And that becomes important in resolving a flood claim, a water claim. So is it a flood or not? Water rises higher than normal. To be a flood, according to insurance terms, water is higher than normal. 2 or more acres of dry land, normally dry land, are involved, and 2 or more properties are involved, or 2 or more properties are involved. I'll give you an example right in my own home. We've got 2 water situations in my house. The front of the house, the gutters are too small, and the front patio step is lower than the surrounding area. So all the water rushes down towards the front door. Anytime it rains, especially when we get 8 inches of rain, there's always standing water out there, and it rises up and threatens to come into the house. That would not be considered a flood because it doesn't involve 2 or more acres or 2 or more properties. It's just my house. It's a little section that's 6 by 6. That's just a puddle that got out of control. So if I had a flood policy and water came in my house, they wouldn't cover the claim for the floor that got damaged. So what I did personally as a homeowner is I've seen this before. So I bought a submersible pump at Home Depot. I just pumped the water over from my front step over to somewhere else, which doesn't really solve the water runoff problem, but it makes it go somewhere else. Because you can't make water go away, you can just make it go somewhere else. However, my neighbor's house on the back door coming off the fairway, my patio was flooded, and so was my neighbor's house, and water was seeping. We put towels up there and everything. Fortunately, it stopped raining. But if that had gotten out of control and come into the house, that would be considered a flood because it covered more than 2 acres, more than 2 properties, 1 or 2 or more properties were involved. So I could have made a claim for that if I needed to. Bad news is flooding isn't covered under your condo or homeowner's policy. It's an excluded cause of loss. It's in the fine print that not everybody reads. To get flooding, water that comes in, basically water that comes in from outside that's normally not there, you need to have a separate flood insurance policy. You'll hear, I've had flood insurance is an excluded cause of loss. But I've had homeowners tell me, well, I had water in my basement was flooded, and when we had a lot of rain, and my old insurance company covered it. Now, I don't doubt that he had water in his basement. I don't doubt that the company covered it, but what I'm sure happened is it wasn't classified by his company as a flood loss. The claims adjuster was able to work some sort of put the claim under some other section of his policy, such as sewer and drain backup coverage, and he could get the flood damage, the water damage covered there. Because remember, to be a flood, you have to have at least 2 properties uncovered. So, should I be worried about flood insurance? I've heard people say, I'm not in a flood zone. It never floods here. They're incorrect. Any place that rains on earth is a potential flood, it can flood. So every place on earth is a flood zone. The top of Mount Everest is in a flood zone, although when it gets that high, I guess all bets are off. So the question becomes, what they really mean is they live in a low risk area. But the question is low risk based on how they say it's low risk. What they probably mean is they don't feel there's much chance of flooding there. I've heard people say that, well, I've lived here 23 years and the water's never gotten close to my house. Well, in environmental terms, 23 seconds is 23 years rather is a nanosecond. Hopefully the luck holds out. During Hurricane Ida, downtown Downingtown was flooded from the McDonald's down to the Downingtown Diner. 6, 8 feet of water down there, and many homes and businesses, including some insurance agents I know, had their businesses and homes wiped out. The insurance agents should have known better and had flood insurance. But anyhow, I heard an older man in his 70s tell me he lived in the area ever since he was all his life, and he said that it was he'd never seen flooding like that since he was a little kid, so that means it had been like 60, 70 years. Well, if you had a home on Lancaster Avenue and you lived there in the interim or you were there in the interim where nothing happened for those 60 years, you're in good shape. But what if you lived there the year it happened? It's just, yeah, it's that's the risk tolerance factor. Flooding causes more damage than any other weather-related loss in the U.S. 90% of all presidential disaster declarations involve flooding. So should I be concerned about being flooded? I'd say base your decision on facts and don't live in denial. Flood insurance. Companies are risk adverse. They don't want to take on bad risks. So in 1972, the government set up the National Flood Insurance Program. It's administered by FEMA after Hurricane Agnes. Basically, they set it up to make flood insurance available to people who lived in risk areas, that bought their homes in risk areas that had repetitive flooding. It wasn't until about 50, 60 years ago, there's a lot of homes built in areas where homes probably should have never been built, too close to water. They didn't start thinking about water runoff and the damage it caused until probably the 60s. So what are the homeowners that were in those areas supposed to? The Army Corps of Engineers they've mapped out flood zones, which they rate them by risk factors. And basically, anything with an A in the zone, the zones have letters. Anything with an A in the zone is a high risk area. X is a low risk zone. And like I said, every piece of land is a flood zone. So the question becomes, how do you find out your area, what zone you're in? And if you look at a flood map, before I was in insurance, I looked at it because I was concerned, and it was it's confusing. Any insurance agent that sells flood insurance could tell you what flood zone you're in. And the thing is, you might be in one flood zone, a different risk area than the guy across the street or the person next door to you, because it all depends on topography. In recent years, private flood insurance has become more common. Private flood insurance is on a FEMA policy. National Flood Insurance Program is underwritten by the U.S. government. Private flood insurance is underwritten by private insurers, and they tend to focus on the lower risk areas that are in flood zones. They tend to offer lower rates too, because it's lower risk, and they do this by being able to better map the nuances of flood zones through satellite technology, and they sharpen their pencil during underwriting. An example of that would be a policyholder I have in Coatesville. Asked for home insurance. She's buying a house. She wanted a home insurance policy. Then she came back and was requiring her to get a flood insurance policy. Well, the first quote through the FEMA flood policy was like $4,200 a year. She was beside herself and didn't know what she should do. Fortunately, her house also qualified for private flood insurance, and she ended up paying about $500 or $600 a year for her flood insurance, and the deal was able to go through. So that's an example where they just had a sharper read on the flood zone, and another carrier would underwrite it differently, and it made it more affordable to her. Some FEMA fun fact or flood insurance fun facts. Like I said, anything in A zone is a higher risk area. That is what you call, you've heard referred to as the 100-year floodplain. Statistically, an A zone has a 26% chance of flooding in any 30-year period, which, by the way, is the length of the average mortgage. In excess of an X zone is the 500-year floodplain, which has a much smaller risk of flooding. More than 20% of the NFIP flood claims are made by policyholders rather in the low and moderate risk. And those are just the people that were policyholders that could make a claim. So it's probably more flooding than that. I'm sure it is. Statistically, the average cost of remediating an inch of water inside your home is about $25,000. And 30% of all flood claims have the people at the shore, the people right next to the Brandywine Creek. It's people that just have a creek behind the houses across the street, or live in downtown Downingtown, where it never floods until it does. The primary causes of flooding in the eastern U.S. are hurricanes and storms, while it's snow melt and rain in the western U.S. So you need flood insurance. What's next? Basics, which I consider risk tolerant. How much risk are you willing to assume? Insurance is risk sharing, so how much of it can you take on yourself? Basically, you take the odds. In my opinion, you take the odds of something negative happening versus as opposed to the cost. So I've got that little formula there, which just, it's a value proposition. What are the odds of something's going to happen? How much will it cost you to do it? Is it worth the money to you? Is it worth the cost? Can you bear the risk? Other alternatives is to, what else can you do to work around it? You're in a situation like me where you can get a submersible pump and pump it away. That's what they're talking about earlier about Hershey Mills. It's all based on topography. So I heard people talk about they're cleaning out the flood, the drains that are clogged. I've heard talk of regrading. There's lots of different, things you can do to the ground to make the water go somewhere else, because you can't make it go away, but you can make it go away from people's houses and go someplace where it won't do any damage or less damage. But when you consider you needing flood insurance, is know your flood zone. Get an up-to-date read on where your house is. Talk to an insurance person who sells flood insurance. Sometimes I've seen where a person, his land is there. Sometimes you run into a flood zone discrepancy. I've seen where a person owns, they own 4 acres with a house on it. Well, the bank says it floods. When you do the flood zone, you dial down the flooding house is on a higher part of the property, so it has a much lower chance of flooding. We've been able to, get that person get away without having to purchase flood insurance or a smaller policy, that sort of thing. Investigate private flood insurance. Ask your insurance person about flood insurance, and if there's FEMA policies or private flood insurance policies, and basically kind of get your facts and make a more informed decision. Seems like I forgot something. Okay, I get time to open it up to questions.